My name is Linda Warren, and on the day my son was supposed to begin the happiest chapter of his life, I watched him shrink in front of 200 guests, as if someone had punched the air out of his lungs. The ballroom was glowing with golden lights, the kind that make everything feel warm and celebratory. The chandeliers sparkled above us, the string quartet was playing a gentle melody, and for a moment I let myself believe that my son, Evan, had finally found a place where he would be cherished. He looked proud in his navy suit, standing beside his bride Claire, who could not stop smiling at him. Then her father stood up. Richard Hale lifted his champagne glass, cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. He had the kind of presence that made people pay attention even before he opened his mouth. Tall, polished, confident in a way that bordered on arrogance. I saw Claire tense, as if she knew what was coming but had no power to stop it. Richard smiled, but it was not the smile of a proud father. It was sharp, almost mocking. "Let me make a toast," he said, turning to the crowd. "Today my daughter is marrying the biggest risk she has ever taken, and frankly the dumbest decision she has ever made." Laughter broke out. Real loud laughed. Some people covered their mouths. Others glanced at Evan with pity. My son stood frozen, the color draining from his face. Claire whispered something to her father, but he ignored her. I felt something inside me tear. For 29 years, I watched my son grow into a man who worked hard, treated people kindly, and never raised his voice to anyone. And now, on the most important day of his life, a man who barely knew him decided to humiliate him publicly. I tightened my grip on my glass and took a slow breath. If Richard wanted to shame my son in front of everyone, then tonight, I would shatter the perfect image he had spent his life building. I would expose every lie he ever told. Long before the wedding day unraveled into humiliation, I had watched my son fall in love in the gentlest way a man can. Evan had always been careful with his heart. He was the kind of person who thought twice before speaking and 3 times before making a promise. So when he told me about a woman named Claire Hale, I knew she must have been someone special. They met at a community design workshop where Evan was volunteering. Claire, an architectural designer, had come to lead a session on urban restoration. He said she talked about old buildings as if they were people who still had something to say. That alone told me why he admired her. For months, whenever Claire's name came up, Evan's whole face softened. He tried to hide it, but a mother always knows. I noticed how he checked his phone more often, how he planned his weekends with more intention, how he seemed lighter, as if something in his life finally made sense. When Claire visited our home for the first time, she walked in with a quiet grace. She thanked me for dinner at least 3 times and helped set the table without being asked. She was gentle, humble, and so clearly in love with my son that I felt my worries melt away. But something changed the moment Evan mentioned her father. Claire's smile faded. She looked down at her hands and said, almost in a whisper, that Richard believed his daughter should marry someone who matched the Hale family's status. Someone with a bigger salary, a bigger title, a bigger future. Someone who was not Evan. That night, after they left, I sat alone in the kitchen, wondering how a man could love his daughter yet make her feel so small. And quietly, I prayed that whatever storms awaited my son, he would have the strength to weather them. The second time I saw Claire, Evan brought her over for dinner again, hoping we could all spend more time together before the engagement became official. I cooked her favorite dish, or at least the one Evan told me she loved, a simple chicken pot pie that reminded her of her childhood. She walked in smiling, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers she said she picked up on the way. But even with her warm gestures, I sensed an uneasiness clinging to her. It was in the small things, the way she kept smoothing the sleeves of her sweater, the way she paused before answering simple questions, the way she flinched slightly whenever her phone lit up on the table. During dinner, Evan was animated, telling me about a project he was excited to work on. Claire listened lovingly, nodding, laughing at the right moments, but her mind seemed to drift somewhere else. When Evan stepped away to take a quick call, the silence between us grew heavy. I asked gently if everything was all right. She hesitated. Her fork hovered above her plate before she set it down. "My dad does not know about this yet," she said, staring at the table. "About us. About Evan. About the engagement?" I stayed quiet, letting her continue. "He has very strong expectations. He wants me to marry someone in a certain circle. Someone he thinks can guarantee a future that looks like his." She exhaled slowly. "He believes love is something you negotiate, not something you choose." I felt a dull ache in my chest, not because of what she said, but because of the fear buried inside her voice. It was the kind of fear that comes from years of being measured, evaluated, judged. When Evan returned, Claire smiled again, as if she had tucked that fear neatly out of sight, but I could still feel it, lingering like a cold draft curling under the door. Something was wrong, and I knew this was only the beginning. The evening Evan met the Hale family for the first time should have been memorable in a happy way, but instead it became the moment I realized how deep the divide truly was. Claire had invited Evan to a formal dinner at her parents' home, a sprawling modern house perched above the lake with wide glass windows and art pieces that looked too expensive to touch. Evan told me later that he felt out of place the moment he stepped inside, not because of the house itself, but because of the way it seemed to echo with expectations. Marianne Hale, Claire's mother, greeted him politely, though with a stiffness that suggested she was following a script. She offered him a drink, asked about his work, smiled when he spoke, but her eyes kept flicking toward her husband, as if waiting for his approval. And Richard did not make him wait long. Before the appetizers were even served, Richard began what Evan later described as an interview disguised as casual conversation. He asked about Evan's salary, his savings, his promotion timeline, whether he planned to buy property, and how soon he expected to double his income. It was not curiosity, it was measurement. When Evan answered honestly, Richard pressed further. Every response seemed to confirm the judgment he had already made. At one point, he said with a faint chuckle, "You seem like a good kid, but Claire needs someone with stability, someone with ambition." Evan swallowed hard. "I work hard, sir. I am building towards something." Richard leaned back in his chair. Building is different from having. Marianne whispered his name in warning, but he ignored her. Claire sat frozen, her hands clenched under the table. She refused to meet Evan's eyes. Later that night, when Evan returned home, he tried to hide how shaken he was. But I saw it. A mother always sees it. He sat at the kitchen table and admitted softly that Richard had made him feel small, as if no matter who he became, it would never be enough. And that was when I first understood. This was not just a protective father. This was a man who believed he had the right to decide the worth of everyone around him. A few weeks after that uncomfortable dinner, something happened that pushed me from worry into action. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had stopped by a small cafe near the park to pick up a coffee before running errands. As I stepped out, I noticed a familiar figure across the street. Richard Hale. He was standing beside a woman much younger than Marianne. She held a toddler on her hip while another child tugged playfully at Richard's sleeve. Richard bent down, lifted the little boy, and kissed the top of his head with a tenderness I had not seen him show Claire. The little girl called him Dad with an ease that froze me in place. I ducked behind a parked car, startled by my own reaction. I watched them walk toward a black SUV, laughing, chatting, moving like a real family. A family Richard had never mentioned. A family Claire certainly knew nothing about. My heart pounded. It would have been easy to convince myself I had misunderstood, but no. The way the woman reached for his arm. The way the children clung to him. The way he let himself be pulled into their orbit. No business partner behaved like that. No colleague, no family friend. That was a man with two lives. I stood there long after they drove away, knowing what I had just seen was not small. It was a crack in the perfect facade he used to judge everyone else. I went home and sat at my dining table for nearly an hour before deciding to act. If Richard could hide an entire family, what else was he capable of hiding? And how much would those secrets eventually cost Claire? I contacted a private investigator named Mark Dalton, a former police officer with a reputation for being thorough and discreet. When I told him what I had witnessed, he did not look surprised. He simply nodded and said he would look into it. That was the day I stopped being a bystander. That was the day I began protecting my son in a way he would never see coming. Mark Dalton worked quickly. Within a week, he called and asked if we could meet in person. His tone alone told me the news would not be simple. We sat in a quiet booth at a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one pays attention to strangers having difficult conversations. He opened a folder and slid a stack of photos toward me. My breath caught. It was the same woman I had seen with Richard, standing in front of a modest house in a neighborhood across the river. The children were in several of the photos, running in the yard, riding bikes, holding Richard's hand. Mark pointed to one of the images. He visits them 3 to 4 times a week. Sometimes he stays overnight. These kids know him as their father. Not uncle, not family friend, father. I stared at the pictures, stunned but not shocked. My instincts had already whispered the truth. Now I had evidence. The woman's name was Jennifer Mercer. She worked at a marketing firm. Her relationship with Richard had begun almost a decade earlier. The boy, Lucas, was 7. The little girl, Emily, was 4. Both were born while Richard was very much still married to Marianne. Mark continued, flipping through more documents, bank statements, rental agreements, transfers. Richard was paying for 2 homes, 2 sets of bills, private school tuition, and family trips he claimed were business travel. I rubbed my temples as the weight of everything started to sink in. This was not an affair. This was a second life deliberately constructed and carefully financed. A life built in the shadows of his public success. But the worst part was not the betrayal of Marianne, or even the emotional manipulation he inflicted on Claire. It was the chilling realization that a man who kept such a massive secret would do anything to protect it. If he was willing to lie to his own daughter for years, what would he do to my son, the man marrying into his world? Mark closed the folder gently. This is only the beginning, Linda. Men who hide this much rarely stop at one lie. I left the diner that day with my hands trembling, the photos tucked in my bag like a storm waiting to break. And I knew with absolute certainty that the truth was much darker than I had imagined. 2 days after revealing Richard's second family, Mark called again. His voice was lower this time, more serious, as if he were choosing his words carefully before speaking them aloud. Linda, we need to meet. What I found goes far beyond a hidden relationship. We met at the same diner, but this time he did not order coffee. He simply opened a thicker folder, one that looked too heavy for the table it rested on. Richard's construction company, Hale Development, was not thriving the way the world believed. It was collapsing. The glossy image he projected through charity events, magazine features, and carefully curated social media posts was nothing more than a mask. Behind it was a financial disaster he had tried to bury for years. Mark walked me through the evidence. Millions of dollars misallocated. Shell companies created under different names. Payments routed through Jennifer's accounts to disguise personal spending as business expenses. A luxury travel budget disguised as investor outreach. A massive housing development project stalled for over a year. The worst part came last. A list of families who had put their savings and retirements into that housing project, expecting homes that would never be finished. People with children. People who trusted him. People who lost everything. I felt sick. Mark continued quietly. The state is preparing an investigation. If it moves forward, he could face prison. But men like him do not fall quietly. They take everyone down with them if they can. I thought of Claire, unaware of the storm surrounding her father. I thought of Marianne, living her life believing her husband was simply busy, not betraying her at every turn. I thought of Evan, who had walked into the Hale family dinner with nothing but good intentions. And I thought of Richard's toast at the rehearsal dinner, the one where he made my son feel like a burden in front of strangers. Suddenly, everything clicked. Richard was not just arrogant, he was desperate. A man watching his empire crumble while pretending it was still standing. A man who needed Claire to marry someone wealthy, influential, able to reinforce his image from the outside. A man who looked at Evan and saw not a person, but a threat to the illusion he was trying to protect. I closed the folder with shaky hands. The truth was no longer something I could ignore. If this secret exploded after the wedding, Claire would be devastated, Marianne would lose everything, and Evan could become collateral damage in a story he never asked to be part of. I walked out of the diner with only one thought. I had to expose Richard before he destroyed everyone around him. The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be a simple celebration before the big day. A chance for the two families to come together, share a meal, and ease whatever tension lingered beneath the surface. I arrived wearing my best dress, determined to be polite, to stay composed, and to support my son no matter what. But the moment I stepped into the venue, I felt Richard's eyes on me. He approached with a practiced smile, the kind that looks warm from a distance but turns cold as soon as you stand directly in front of it. Marianne hovered nearby, greeting guests, unaware of the storm quietly brewing around her. Claire stood beside Evan, their hands intertwined, trying their best to pretend everything was normal. Richard leaned closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear him. "Your son is not what I imagined for Claire. I hope you understand that." I held my voice steady. Evan loves her. He treats her well. That should matter. Richard smiled again, but this time the edges of it sharpened. Love is not enough. My daughter deserves stability, influence, a husband who can elevate her, not weigh her down. I felt heat rise in my chest. Before I could respond, he continued. "If Evan cannot meet the expectations of this family, then he needs to step aside. And you, he added, pointing subtly at my hand, you would be wise to stay out of decisions that do not concern you. Every word was a warning, a threat wrapped in politeness. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and realized something important. He did not see me as Evan's mother. He saw me as the only person standing in his way. That night, when I returned home, I opened the folder Mark had given me and prepared 3 separate envelopes. One for Evan, one for Claire, and one for Marianne. If Richard wanted to play games, then so be it, I would be ready. The morning of the wedding felt strangely calm, the kind of quiet that settles over a town right before a storm. I arrived early, wanting to see Evan before everything began, but he was already surrounded by groomsmen and photographers. Even from a distance, I could tell something was off. His smile was tight, unsure, as if he were bracing himself for something he could not name. Claire looked beautiful walking down the aisle, her dress soft and flowing, her eyes glistening as she met Evan's. For a moment I let myself believe love would win, that whatever darkness Richard carried would not spill into this day. The ceremony was short and sweet, filled with promises of support and partnership. But the reception was a different world. As guests settled into their seats, waiters moving gracefully between tables, the atmosphere shifted. Richard rose, champagne glass in hand, and the room fell quiet. Even the band seemed to soften their playing, sensing that the father of the bride was about to deliver one of his grand speeches. He began slowly, thanking everyone for coming, praising the beauty of the venue, complimenting Claire's dress. People nodded politely. Claire smiled nervously. Evan reached for her hand. Then Richard's tone changed. "Today is a day of celebration," he said, "but also a day of acceptance. My daughter has chosen a path that is unconventional, risky even, some might say impulsive." A few guests chuckled. Richard lifted his glass higher, to Claire, who has always had a heart bigger than her judgment, and to Evan, the most questionable decision she has ever made. Laughter erupted, real laughter, sharp, echoing, cutting. I saw Evan's shoulders tense, his smile vanished. Claire whispered, "Dad, please stop." But Richard continued, as if the damage he caused only fueled him more. In that moment, surrounded by mocking voices and clinking glasses, I felt something inside me harden. This was no longer pride or ego. This was cruelty, deliberate and public. I rose from my seat, steady and calm, knowing exactly what I was about to do. If Richard wanted to humiliate my son in front of everyone, then I would unveil the truth in front of those same eyes. The storm he started would end with me. I walked toward the stage with a calmness I did not feel. Every step felt both heavy and necessary, as if the floor itself was pushing me forward. Conversations softened, laughter faded. By the time I reached the microphone, the room had fallen into an uneasy silence. Richard looked at me with mild annoyance, as though I were interrupting a performance he had rehearsed for weeks. Evan stared at me confused. Claire watched with wide, frightened eyes. I took a breath and began. "I would like to say a few words, not as the groom's mother, but as someone who believes that a wedding should begin with truth, not humiliation." A ripple moved through the crowd. Richard laughed under his breath. "Oh, Linda, this is hardly the time." "On the contrary," I said, "it is the only time." I reached into my clutch and placed 3 envelopes on the podium. Then I lifted the first stack of papers. Photos, documents, bank statements, everything Mark had uncovered. "You see, Richard, you have spent months treating my son as though he were unworthy of your daughter. You have judged him by his salary, his future, his background. And yet, the man doing all this judging is living a life built on lies." Guests leaned forward, whispering began. Claire's hands flew to her mouth. I held up a photo of Richard with Jennifer and the children. "This is your other family. The one you visit several times a week. The one you have supported financially for nearly a decade." Marianne gasped, clutching the back of a chair for support. "This," I continued, "is where part of your company's money has been going, not to business travel, not to investors, to a second household." Richard's face drained of color. "Sit down," he hissed. I ignored him and lifted more documents. Bank transfers disguised as corporate expenses. Payments routed through Jennifer's account. A stalled development project that left dozens of families without the homes they paid for. I raised my voice enough for every person to hear. "These people trusted you, Richard. They gave you their savings, their futures. And you hid the truth behind charity galas and speeches like the one you just gave. You shamed my son while your own empire was crumbling under the weight of your dishonesty." A guest stood up. "Is this true, Richard?" Another voice chimed in. My sister invested in that project. She lost everything." The room erupted. Marianne sobbed. Claire looked as if her entire world had collapsed. Evan stepped forward. "Mom, what is all this?" I turned to him, my voice softening. "The truth, sweetheart. The truth I wish I never had to show you today." For the first time that evening, Richard had nothing to say. No laughter. No insults. No control. Only silence. In that silence, the entire room saw him for who he truly was, a man who built his life on deceit while tearing down others to protect the illusion. And the illusion had just shattered. The moment I stepped away from the microphone, the room spiraled into chaos. Guests whispered fiercely among themselves. Some left their seats to console Marianne, who sat frozen, her hands trembling as she stared at the photos scattered across the table. Others approached Claire, but she could barely speak. She looked like someone who had just watched her entire childhood crumble in a single breath. Evan stood there, holding the envelope I had left for him earlier, but he had not opened it. His expression was not relief, not gratitude, but something far heavier: confusion, hurt, maybe even betrayal. "Mom," he said quietly, "why did you not tell me?" His voice cracked just enough to break my heart. Before I could answer, he stepped back, shaking his head. "I need air. I just need a minute." He walked out of the ballroom without another word. Claire followed him halfway to the door, then stopped, unsure if she should go after him or stay with her mother. In the end, she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Richard tried to approach her, but she flinched and turned away. That small gesture, that tiny recoil, seemed to wound him more deeply than any document or accusation ever could. I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a numbness that settled deep inside my chest. The truth had been necessary, but necessary things often leave ruins behind. That night, I drove home alone, the wedding ring still on my son's finger, the echo of Richard's laughter still lingering in my ears. And for the first time since the investigation began, I wondered whether exposing the truth on this day had been the right choice. The days following the wedding felt strangely quiet, as if the entire town was holding its breath. I spent most of that time replaying everything in my mind, wondering if there had been a gentler way to reveal the truth, but any attempt to rewrite the past could not change what had already begun. Within a week, the story broke. Local news stations reported that Hale Development was under state investigation. Articles appeared online describing financial discrepancies, stalled projects, and families left without the homes they had invested in. Reporters camped outside the Hale residence. Marianne stopped answering her phone. Claire temporarily moved in with a friend. And Richard, the man who once dominated every room he walked into, suddenly had nowhere to hide. 3 months later, the inevitable happened. Richard Hale was arrested on multiple charges, including fraud and misappropriation of company funds. Images of him in handcuffs spread quickly, replacing the polished reputation he had spent decades crafting. But the moment that stayed with me most was not his arrest. It was a quiet knock on my door 2 days later. I opened it to find Claire on my porch, wrapped in a simple coat, her eyes tired but clear. She took a shaky breath. "Thank you," she said softly. "You did what no one else dared to do. You saved more than just my future." Then she stepped forward and hugged me, not as the mother of her fiancé, but as the woman who had finally told her the truth she had lived too long without. For the first time since the wedding, I felt a small piece of peace return. Despite the chaos that had unfolded, life eventually settled into something quieter, something more manageable. Evan did not speak to me for nearly a week after the wedding. He stayed with a friend from work, answering my messages with short replies that told me he was still trying to make sense of everything. I did not push him. Sometimes silence is not distance. It is simply someone finding the courage to feel what hurts. One evening, just as the sun was slipping behind the trees, my doorbell rang. When I opened it, Evan stood there, hands in his pockets, looking younger than he had in years. "Mom," he said, his voice soft. I read the envelope. We sat on the porch steps while the cicadas hummed around us. He told me he had needed time to understand why I had chosen that moment to expose the truth. He admitted he had felt blindsided, embarrassed, even angry. But as he read through the documents, as he saw the depth of Richard's lies, he realized I had been carrying a burden no parent should carry alone. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I should have trusted you sooner." I pulled him into a hug, one that seemed to melt the last layer of tension between us. Claire reached out to him a few days later. Their first conversation was slow and fragile, like two people learning how to breathe again. But they kept talking. Painfully, honestly, patiently. 6 months later, they held a small ceremony in a garden behind a local chapel. No grand speeches. No towering floral arrangements. No spotlight. Just family. Just truth. Just two people choosing each other without the shadow of her father's expectations. And when their first child was born a year after that, Evan placed the tiny boy in my arms and whispered, "Mom, this is the future we get to build now." It was the kind of quiet triumph no headline could ever capture. News of Richard's arrest faded from headlines over time, replaced by newer stories and scandals that had nothing to do with us. But for the Hale family, the consequences lingered quietly in the background, shaping every day that followed. Claire continued to visit her mother, helping her rebuild her life piece by piece. Marianne filed for divorce within months of the arrest, choosing peace over the illusion she once helped maintain. She rarely spoke Richard's name anymore, as if removing it from her vocabulary could soften the past. Then, one afternoon nearly a year later, Claire appeared at my door again, her expression thoughtful rather than distressed. "He is sick," she said simply. Richard had been diagnosed with an aggressive illness while serving his sentence. With no image left to uphold, he spent his days in a small medical ward, no suits, no spotlight, no audience. Just a man stripped of the armor he had worn his entire life. Before he grew too weak to write, he sent Claire a letter, a short one, apologizing not for the crimes that took him to prison, but for the fear he had planted in her since childhood, for the expectations, for the pressure, for the shame he used as discipline. He ended with a request, not forgiveness, just a hope that she would live a life unshaped by his failures. Claire read the letter in one breath, folded it carefully, and said, "I forgive him, but I will not forget. Forgetting is what allowed it all to happen." Her voice held both sorrow and clarity, a kind of wisdom that only arrives after surviving something heavy. And in that moment I knew she had finally stepped out of his shadow. Months passed, and life settled into a quieter rhythm. Claire and Evan focused on building their marriage free from the shadow her father once cast over every choice she made. They'd bought a small starter home and filled it with sunlight, plants, mismatched furniture, and the kind of laughter that only grows where fear has died. One evening they invited me over for dinner. Nothing fancy, roasted chicken, cheap wine, jazz humming in the background. But as I watched them move around the kitchen together, effortlessly, gently, I felt something soften in me. This was what love looked like without an overseer, without control, without a man like Richard rewriting the rules for everyone else. After dinner, Claire walked me to the door. She paused, her hand on the frame, as if weighing a thought before speaking. "You know," she said quietly, "if your voice hadn't cut through that room at our wedding, I might still be living for his approval, still trying to earn something he was never capable of giving." I shook my head. All I did was tell the truth. "Sometimes," Claire replied, "the truth is the only lifeline." She hugged me longer than she ever had before, steadier than the trembling embrace from the night everything fell apart. As I drove home, I realized something simple but profound. We don't just save people with dramatic gestures. Sometimes we save them by refusing to stay silent. In the end, Richard Hale lost everything he built on fear, but Claire, she gained her freedom, and witnessing that was worth every storm we walked through.